You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
Not since the 1970s has American higher education seen so prodigious an emergence of a new academic field as has been the case of data science. The first degree programs in data science were established less than a decade ago, and the major is now the fastest growing at the undergraduate level. At a time when colleges and universities are assessing the viability of even long-established fields, data science is the subject of intense institutional consideration, with one line of thought holding that the skills and aptitudes fostered in and by data science are as essential to a quality education as to be made a common requirement of all students, regardless of chosen field of study. Another view holds that data science is sufficiently distinctive and developed to merit its own place among professional fields of study. As a result, schools of data science are beginning to emerge as separate but strongly interdisciplinary units with undergraduate and graduate degree programs and burgeoning executive and modular offerings. And these various views are not the inside baseball of academia. A field not yet 10 years old is projected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to grow by 36% between 2021 and 2031, parenthetically understated as much faster than average. Moreover, the sectors of society requiring the talent and skills of data scientists include organizations and people trying to cope with the tsunami of digital information produced incessantly. In short, any and everyone. For some time now, Innovators has devoted attention to data science, with interviews dating back to our earliest days. The time now seems right to learn from someone who has, in various roles, been in the forefront of the field, but also has experience that affords him a breadth of perspective that is not only academic. Indeed, our guest is someone who likely has a clearer sense of where data science is heading than most. Philip Bourne is the Stephenson Dean of the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, where he previously served as director of the Data Science Institute. But according to a 16-year-old on whom I rely for all things technology, Dr. Bourne is one of the two guys who had the good sense to create Sci-V, or what that same authority shared with me was the cool idea of putting YouTube and TED Talks together for nerds. Sci-V is a tool for enabling scientists to share research and publications through video and video presentations. An Australian, Dr. Bourne earned his doctorate from Flinders University and did postdoctoral research at the University of Sheffield in the UK. He then joined the faculty at Columbia University, moved to the University of California, San Diego, where he was vice chancellor, and then joined the National Institutes of Health as associate director for data science before moving to the University of Virginia. Welcome to Innovators. I want to begin our interview with a rather extended question for you. The School of Data Science at the University of Virginia was established in part because of a very large gift of $120 million on top of and including a previous $10 million gift that created the Data Science Institute. Now, as I understand it, both gifts were made by the Quantitative Foundation, and that name alone suggests the donor may not have required a great deal of persuasion on the importance of the field of data science. But still, a 203-year-old university such as Virginia is seen by some as a very traditional institution that's not likely to create a new school for a field that is just then emerging. Furthermore, whenever you see gifts the size of that was provided UVA for data science, those kinds of gifts are typically made to support and advance a program that has a well-established record of success. So take, for example, Northwestern University that's received a very large gift for its biomedical programs. Or if you go back a few more years, Michael Bloomberg's gift to Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And then the School of Data Science departs somewhat from the norm by the explicit commitment to be designed as, and here I quote, an open ecosystem that fosters interdisciplinary research, teaching, and partnerships across the university with the private sector and with governmental entities. You led the institute that preceded the school, and you were involved in much of the planning and, I suspect, the solicitation of the gift that made the school possible. What were the parts, people, and processes that made all the necessary pieces come together? And what were and what are the reasons for a separate school of data science?
It's an interesting question. Let me just say that there was an Institute of Data Science before I arrived. That was started in 2013. What attracted me to come to UVA from where I was in the NIH and the federal government was the fact that even though it was an institute, it was actually awarding degrees, which is an unusual thing to happen in general. And I thought that was really important because it gave it a sense of independence from the other schools, which I think was to some degree I felt important. That was only one of a number of reasons for coming to UVA, which is just a really spectacular place. But yeah, the gift, interestingly, the major donor you mentioned was already on our advisory board. And that continued in my tenure and until today. Interestingly, he was also ex officio on the search committee that actually was responsible for my coming. So in a way, I had a certain level of endorsement, presumably, before I started.
You're being modest.
And I guess my main job was not to screw it up. So I did my best at that. But then when the opportunity came along, as you say, as a major gift, I went to the incoming president at the time, Jim Ryan, who was president-elect. I said to him, Jim, there's this really amazing opportunity, but the donor, I'm not sure it was absolutely prerequisite, but it was certainly important to the donor that we actually be a school. And I could see merits in that, which I'll get into perhaps in a moment. But Jim was very wise. He's a great leader. There's no question about it. He said to me, we've got to prove a big gift doesn't make a school. You've got to prove two things to me, at least. One of them is that it's sustainable. And the other is that the other deans want it, of the 11 schools. So that was absolutely key. So we then started to prepare. We put together a manifesto, which is actually online. Everything we try and do is transparent and public as much as possible. And it was really describing the school. And then we spent literally a year going around to all of the other schools, sort of convincing them this was a benefit and not a threat. Particularly in the notion, the way we fund here is with the RCM model, which means funding goes directly to the school. So there's a certain level of protectionism. This happens in many organizations, including NIH, by the way. That's a whole nother story. Anyway, after visiting with all of the deans, there was, we came to this notion of a school without walls, and where, it's really a highly collaborative enterprise. And so as a school, we don't really exist to be in our own right. We exist to really help the institution and raise and provide quantitative skills across all of the other disciplines. And, we really mean that. I mean, you could say it, and then when we got accepted as a school and it went through the faculty senate and it was approved by the state, we could have reneged on that, but we'll never renege on that. I don't, certainly while I'm around, and I suspect whoever comes along in the future, because that's sort of how we see ourselves. And I could go into lots of different mechanisms for how we facilitate that and make that a truth rather than just a vague statement. But so that's really what got us going. And in the end, and part of the manifesto that was reviewed by the Senate, all of the other 11 deans wrote very strong letters of support. So that's really
remarkable.
tough.
Remarkable. The RCM model does indeed contribute sometimes to a zero-sum perspective on life, in which whatever you get is taken from someone else. So I admire your courage and your perspicacity, at least.
Well, I had some, if I may, I had some training in that, when we're having a meeting with all the deans and the president about the school, the dean of the medical school leaned over to me and said, "This must be really difficult for you." And I said, "You kidding? This is like a walk in the park compared to NIH, where there was 27 institutes and centers. All funding came by direct appropriation to each institute from Congress. And it was a 40 billion versus about a $4 billion a year operation. This is a walk in the park." Which of course was not quite true, but I'd had some training, let's just put it that way.
There's a joke that's sometimes told that when the NIH is up to its budget period, that everybody wears Kevlar vest if they're head of one of those institutes. But I'm sure that's apocryphal, so I'm not going to claim that true. Whenever somebody talks about data science and you ask them, tell me exactly what's included in that. The list gets to be about 15, 18, sometimes 20 different things, activities that get listed under that. And so at times it's very hard to understand what data science is and what brings its coherence about. Now, I'm sure that you must have faced this question when you were talking with your colleagues and deans and the like. So what is the coherence that comes about in data science that still allows it to sort of be home to a multitude of methods, techniques, and perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, there are standard definitions that sort of go along the lines, well, it's, there's part stats, part computer science, part applied mathematics applied to a variety of different fields, which is true. And that would be one definition. If you ask 10 people what the data science was, you get 10 answers. But like, as is true of the internet, except, we all use it every day. We all use data science every day. So in some ways, a loose definition doesn't detract from what the field is. But having said that, when we were getting going, we'd actually already formed the school, and suddenly we said, "Hey, wait a minute, let's stop and say to ourselves, what is it we're actually doing here?"
Yeah, that's probably not a bad idea.
What is data science to us? So we have, I got to say, it's just an amazingly fun experience because we have a whole shared governance model around the school. And we all sit around, all the staff, the faculty, and students when they're available to, really debate and discuss what it is that we're doing. We're having that discussion right now about how we organize ourselves, but when we come back to the notion of data science itself, after a considerable debate, we came up with this notion of what we call the 4+1 model. And everybody is behind it. So even if they don't agree with it 100%, they speak about it. And so it gives us this sort of frame of reference that everybody has. And effectively, it's the 4. Analytics is the obvious piece. And that's what people tend to think of as machine learning, AI, deep learning, and so on. But for us, it's really only a quarter of it. And we literally a quarter. The other elements are systems, which is really hardware and software and security, cybersecurity, and so on, that you need to operate in the field, particularly with, not necessarily, but often with large data sets. Then there is design, which is really about the human-computer interaction, which comes in at all stages of the data lifecycle, really. We think about it in the context of things like visualization and dissemination at the sort of output end. And then the last one of the 4 is value. which is really the tension that exists between the ability of data science to do something, but also in a positive way, but often that also has potentially nefarious effects. So there's a tension there between the good and the bad, if you like. So that's really a key part of what we're doing. And then the plus one are all the verticals where we apply that, those four components. And we really try and keep that balance. I worry about it still, with the idea that, that the value you could also, it's more than ethics, but ethics is part of it. Mm-hmm. And you worry about that becoming sort of like a superficial outlier that becomes a field of its own, but doesn't influence everything else we do. Mm-hmm. And we're really trying to avoid that from happening. And then I would say in terms of an overall umbrella, like I'd say many of these data science initiatives, not just ours, which I think is really exciting, is they speak about it and we speak about it in the context of responsible data science and society, where it's really being applied to try and address some of the clearly pretty significant problems we have now and are on the horizon. So I think that's sort of, in sum, the kind of motivation and the mode for which we operate.
I also think that it reflects something that it's an emerging aspect that we'll talk about maybe a little bit more, and that is the sense that science is not value-free. It never has been, it never will be, and therefore it becomes an ongoing sort of tension that will never go away, or if it did, you'd probably need to worry about it a whole lot more. The thing that strikes me about it is it lends itself to what I've alluded to elsewhere, and like engineering did maybe a couple of, maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, when engineering took up these 14 great challenges, and psychology talked about the 3 great questions. And it strikes me that 4+1 definition of yours comes very close to starting to set out, in some ways, if you let the values part kind of run through them, it sort of gives some guidance to what you do there. And so it strikes me that that's an organizing principle as well as something that just sits there to describe it. So it strikes me it is a kind of unique way of doing it, but it's by far the simplest one I've heard. And sometimes I think simple is better.
I mean, we pursue it to the end that, when we design a course, we have a color coding for the 4 components. Mm-hmm. So we look at how those 4 components are actually mapped to that course, so that whatever that course might be, there's some element of all 4 within that course. Obviously, it might specialize in one, right, but the others are also important to it. And so it creates this sort of hybridization across the enterprise, both from we obviously think about the same way in the research. The research obviously applies to different verticals, but we think about every element of research within the context of the 4.
My compliments to you and your colleagues. I have not heard one that has emerged quite so cleanly as that. And I'm sure there's probably late night arguments that went on to get there, but still. Let me ask you a question. I don't know where you're building, because I know a building was part of the grant that was made to you. And I'm curious about that, because we're still in the midst of this whole question of remote work and teleworking and so forth, and nomads and so forth. I'm kind of curious. You will have the capability to host people who come to Charlottesville. You will have the ability to reach out through technology to people anywhere in the world. But is there some notion on your part about how a school of data science deals with the fundamental question of human interaction, and whether or not people need to be resident, people need to be face-to-face? Was that something that you sort of had to deal with early on? And by the way, is your building almost ready?
The building's still a year away, but it's coming along. And just as an aside, before I answer your question, it's amazing what difference it's made to how we're perceived as an enterprise within the university. There's no doubt that a physical presence, means something. And everybody knew there was a school of data science, but now, partly because it holds up the traffic, but they're building it. but everybody's aware that there's this physical object, this big object sitting there that actually is opening up a whole new area of the university, which is exciting in itself, which I can get into. But just to get to your question, really it's about the nature of work and going forward. And, frankly, the design and aspects of the building happened, several years ago now. So it, certainly predating COVID. Yes. What's clear is, yes, the nature of work is changing post, or I should say post, we're not quite there yet, but nearly post-COVID. And, that is undoubtedly affecting. However, even if there is a greater hybrid work, I think we're still in good shape because there's clearly a desire to, as much as possible, to at least spend some time together. Mm-hmm. And we're growing so fast that our building is going to be full before it opens. So this could actually be, to some degree, a blessing rather than a curse.
Bill, I better warn you, don't go back in asking for a new building too quickly. That's the surest way to be hung by a bunch of deans.
Well, it turns out we're actually already in the process of thinking about that. But really, as part of this school without walls, it's a bit ironic talking about school without walls when we're building walls. But, there's a lot of effort now towards more interdisciplinarity, which is, we're helping to drive. So the idea that we create an interdisciplinary research building that would adjoin us, the one we already have, and we would, our overflow would occupy that building. I mean, none of this is gospel yet, but these are the kinds of things that are being talked about.
Yes. Let me turn to something that you've touched on. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read something here. The October issue of Nature devoted its entire issue to a critical analysis that was entitled Racism, Overcoming Science's Toxic Legacy. And early in the issue, there's this very powerful point made. And it goes, I didn't see another Black person in computer science until more than a decade after high school, says Juan Gilbert of the University of Florida in Gainesville. This is not just a problem in computer science. Black people make up 13% of the US workforce, yet receive barely more than 2% of the country's PhDs in the natural sciences and engineering in 2021. Other communities of color are also underrepresented. Now, is there any reason to expect that student enrollment and degree completion in data science is really going to be any different in terms of representation of persons of color? And will students also be taught by a diverse data science faculty? And if so, why?
Yeah, this is clearly a critical question, and it's something that we think about a lot. It's really important to us. I mean, I think it's important to everyone now. And just by, the sad truth is the fact that it is important is a relatively new thing in itself, which, is important for driving change. And clearly the University of Virginia does not have a particularly good history in this regard. So, we have a particular, I think, need and desire to change how things operate. And I think data science as a new entity that doesn't really have a history, I think there's an opportunity there. It's an opportunity actually for in higher ed more generally, but putting that aside and sticking with the racial card issue. I mean, what's clear is, we've talked about the idea that we have more Black faculty. The way perhaps it's not a good way to describe it. The way I describe it, that's like shuffling the chairs on the Titanic. Mm-hmm. It's just the number of those people available today, and the opportunities they have. It'd be very hard to get them. And however, that's not quite so the case with the student population. It's still not to the kind of percentages you were talking about. It is in our programs. In fact, I would say we have a very good demographic, both in terms of race and gender within our student population, and both at the master's level and at the PhD level.
Very
But
good.
well, clearly, but there's still clearly issues. We need to be building. We've got to look at this in the long term. This is at least a 10-year endeavor to get this right, in my mind, anyway. And so we're embarking on that endeavor. We, like many other places, have hired an associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's actually been a huge eye opener to me, and many of us. This person, Siri Russell, actually came, established the Office of DEI for Albemarle County, which is where the university resides. So this is someone who came from a different perspective outside of academia, and that's proved to be enormously valuable. So that helps us at least begin to think in the right way. And part of what we're doing in that context is establishing a framework for what we do in K-12. So it's clear we have to get all the way back to kindergarten, really, but to really provide the opportunities at the beginnings and see that pipeline begin to build. So that's really our approach to it.
And it's a long haul.
It's a long haul. But given that it's the demographic of the field is quite different to what you would see in terms of faculty. The majority of our faculty are quite young. At one point, we wrote a job ad for a professor and we wanted someone with a PhD in data science. And we each suddenly stopped and looked at ourselves and started laughing because there was no such person. I mean, we now have a PhD program, but that just started this academic year, and a couple of other schools have them, but they're barely going.
Yeah, I was going to say I wouldn't be optimistic about finding that professor, and especially somebody who's over the age of 35. I don't think that's going to happen.
So, go ahead. Sorry.
No, well, let me just turn to, we now have you as a model of leadership. Now, I want you to think seriously about that. That means from now on, all deans of data science have to be Australian, handsome, brilliant, kind to puppy dogs and the like, which I've been informed you are. But in case there are not many people who meet all of those criteria, and that might be the case, what do you see as the kinds of experiences, the kind of expertise, the kind of skills, and I don't mean simply technical skills, I'm talking about interpersonal skills. You've run large organizations, you've run organizations that are made up of complex individuals. What are the skills that deans of data science are going to need over these next, let's use yours, 10 years? What are they going to need to have to be really successful in a field that by everybody's estimate, we desperately need to move quickly on?
Yeah, I mean, I've had no formal training in leadership. I do write articles in professional development. I just wrote one on leadership not very long ago. Yeah. I actually describe leaders as two types. Which are a bit like politicians. They're dictators, or they lead by democratic principle. And ironically, I think in leadership, both can be successful. I think one organization is much more fun to work in than the other. And we certainly, operate by, shared governance, democratic kind of model. And, we all try and care about each other, and always the person comes first. And I think another thing that we're pushing, which is unusual, and we touched on it before, is that in the grand scheme of things, the order of relevance is students first, university second, school third. And so, we really try to act in that way, because we think that's ultimately what's best for everyone, particularly our role as a public university within the state. In terms of sort of management as it relates to data science, I think that and it's sort of a general axiom, but I think it's really, the way I look at it is it's about getting the right people on the bus. They will figure out where to drive it, but really, and giving them the freedom to be able to, express and evolve and develop within the framework of what we're putting together, while at the same time sort of meeting what the demands are from our students and the public and and so forth. And I think we're doing, and everybody's bought into that. And I mean, sometimes they've bought into aspects of it in a formal way. So we have, for example, a policy around open scholarship, which is becoming a big thing now, and
Yep.
with respect to certainly federal funding, it's now becoming increasingly a requiment.
It is a requirement.
It is and that's being ramped up even further. So all our faculty sign on to the notion that their research is open, and that they can opt out for good reasons like IP or whatever, but generally speaking, and then we try and support that, and that's just a principle. We have a set of guiding principles, and openness is one of them, and transparency, which is related to, in a way, is another. And we've come up with these, along with our model for data science. We have a sort of set of guiding principles for the school that everybody's aware of and buys into as well. So again, it's a management technique, if you like, but it puts everybody on the same page.
Let me ask you a specific question, because it deals with a challenge that we're seeing from our perspective. There aren't many places that people can earn PhDs from, and there weren't any in 1996 or whatever. And so in many cases, the people who come forward as candidates for department chairs or deans and the like will come from fields like molecular biology or analytics from business. And then that poses some interesting questions about traditional disciplines and how they work in terms of the tenure and promotion and all of that. Is it your sense that the kind of ecumenical spirit that data science seems to have, that nobody pays a whole lot of attention to what discipline you're in, as long as you can bring to the table a set of knowledge and skills? But is it your sense that that issue is perhaps moot now because of the very nature of the discipline, that it is such a diverse group, that it's possible to go get an engineer to become a dean and not have to worry about the process, albeit we're still, the jury's out because we've only been at this for less than a decade in effect. So tell me about that whole challenge of leadership who don't have a degree in data science.
I love the question. So it's interesting because we all have this view that the path is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be what's gone before. It doesn't have to be traditional in the way it's been before. Yeah. However, what happens as you grow is you're hiring people who, have come from other places. If I had $1 for each faculty member who said, well, where I came from, X, we used to do, I would say, I don't care. That's not, that's not here. So there's, but how do you, but you can only take that so far within a system. So an example of that would be when I first presented the school to the faculty senate of the university, I said we were contemplating not having tenure. That created a visceral reaction. And the president said to me, I think you're going to have to come up with a different model. Because
he was thinking of your life and safety.
Yes. And in the end, we now have a sort of rolling tenure model. And it's sort of a compromise in some ways, but there's definitely the notion of tenure. And then of course you're also constrained by the nature of not what you're doing, but what's around you. An example of that would be when we make a joint appointment,
Mhm.
which is, based on this notion of a school without walls, is one very important way by which we infuse ourselves across the university. But that's not straightforward. It's not like twice as much work. It's 3 times, the MOUs that go back and forward and all this kind of stuff, because, everybody wants their own piece of the action. But there's a general notion that, these are important appointments. So we are making them, and significant numbers of them. So it can be done, but it's harder than it should be. And then, of course, so I could go on about this for a long time, but the notion that, someone comes from industry, that they don't have this traditional, oh my goodness, of course, they actually know more about some aspects of what we're doing than, because a lot of this is what's really intriguing about the field. A lot of the breakthroughs are being done in industry. They're not being done in academia.
Exactly.
And, to ignore that would be a huge mistake in my mind. So, we're bringing in people who don't necessarily have the traditional background, but that creates, it certainly raises eyebrows, to say the least.
And fits sometimes. Yep. Just a comment on that. I'll come back in a couple of years, Phil, and I'm going to check to see how many courtesy appointments you have and how many professors of practice you have. And then I'm going to know that you probably survived the next few years. I want to thank you very much for taking time out. You are a welcome sort of spirit in a world that needs some really good thinking. And I wish you very much success, you and your colleagues, because I think you're doing it in a really remarkably creative way. And I appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for having me. I have to say, we're all having, I think we all feel like we are making a difference. And what's equally important is we're having fun doing it.
Even better.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.